All right, good afternoon, students. Let me get this where I want it. All right, welcome to week 4, Sociology of Work. We'll be touching on a big topic, but we're going to focus on it in a rather narrow way, and that is work and technology. We touched on this a little bit, just to scratch the surface, the very first week. And now I want to look at it in a little more detail. As I said, this is a big topic, and one could probably devote an entire semester to this if you wanted to specialize in the analysis of organizations and work and the various ways in which technologies have been applied to the labor process, to use the Marxist term, or management, or efficiency, or productivity. Pretty unlimited. The reading I have for you this week focuses on what takes place in call centers and is consistent with the approach I'm taking in terms of the sociology of work, and that is a critical perspective on the way work is organized and the impact it has on workers. So that is the focus primarily, and I think you will find this particularly relevant for the current world of work in which we are ensconced and in which you probably will be working. All right, so let me start with a few premises in terms of the way sociologists approach this question, and really the way sociologists approach technology generally. And that is, technology is never neutral. There is a tendency for people to believe that some new innovation, some new technology doesn't necessarily have any particular bias, okay, that it's neutral, it's going to be applied. And, there had been expectations that somehow all of the technological innovations that would be taking place would benefit mankind, humankind, womankind, and that would free us from oppressive conditions of work. Well, the key point is that technology, new innovations, they do not always have positive results for the human condition. And in fact, this week we will be pointing to the dark side, if you like, of the technological introduction into the workplace. And here we're primarily talking about the most advanced forms of information technology. Why do we not view technology as some neutral, inevitably progressive force? And it's largely because technology and how it's used and what impact it has really depends on the interest of the person who is in control of and making decisions about how technology is applied, how it's implemented, for what purpose. And in most cases, in the workplace, let's face it, workers do not make the decision about how technology is going to be used. So if we understand the basic fundamental premise of the larger class in terms of social class and the difference between managers and owners and workers, and if it's the owners and the managers who are largely introducing the technology, then we should understand that it's going to be introduced and used and applied for a particular purpose. And that often is to advance their interests, not necessarily, even though they'll try to convince the workers of this, that it's in the interest of the workers. All right, so this is always the way we need to think about technology. I have a colleague who's studying, robots, artificial intelligence, and sometimes I find the comments and statements about these technological developments to be somewhat naive in their utopian, optimistic assumptions. All right, 2 basic sociological concepts. We did talk about unintended consequences earlier. I gave you the example of the capitalists bringing workers together in a factory in order to control them. And it turns out that the workers, you get them together, they talk to each other, they communicate, And rather than having full control over them by virtue of having them in the factory to observe, monitor, surveil, these are big terms this week, they communicate with each other and organize. Okay. Manifested latent functions is another couple of concepts that are very important. I don't think I've mentioned them so far this semester. They come, both of these come from the great sociologist Robert Merton. And Robert Merton talked about the way in which all programs and policies have not only unintended and unanticipated consequences, but often there are manifest functions of some particular program or policy, or in this case, application of technology, and latent functions. So the manifest function is the officially stated reason for, let's say, in the context of what we're talking about this week, introducing technology. We are introducing technology in order to allow you to be able to be more productive as workers. Okay. That's the officially stated reason, right? That's the manifest function in the language of Merton. What's the latent function? The latent function is the unstated function. It also serves to keep track of what you're doing and how hard you're working and how much effort you're expending. Sometimes the unspoken is more important than the spoken. That is, the latent is more important than the manifest. So, I always like to introduce concepts in sociology that we can apply to many different areas. I want to go back to a book that was written, quite prescient, I have to say, by Shoshana Zuboff. And we will return to Shoshana Zuboff at the end of this lecture. Her current work, this is 1984. 1984. Did anyone read the book 1984? Maybe there's something to that, okay? Most of you, I'm sure, none of you were alive in 1984. I was, by the way, okay? Ronald Reagan was in power, and it wasn't so damn wonderful. I can tell you that. But don't get me started on Reagan. She wrote this book called In the Age of the Smart Machine. And she was looking at, just at that time, the very, very beginning of information technologies. Nowhere near what has been developed and what you, on a daily basis, are exposed to. And the big question was, of course, what impact is this going to have? As a good social critic, she didn't assume it's inevitably going to free us and liberate us, and it's going to be nothing but progressive. She said, is it going to be utopian, or is it going to be dystopian? Is it going to be something in between? And the point she made was that the machine does not just automate, okay? So automation would be like the actions that you take physically, there is now a machine that replaces those physical activities, okay? That's a form of automation. She also introduced the idea of info. That is, it doesn't just automate, it infomates. Clever, smart. And this is what she called the potential for an information panopticon. Not only is it automating and replacing maybe physical actions that you take, but it's also collecting information about what you as a worker are doing. 1984. She was talking about this. All right. And I'm not going to read through this. I'm going to ask you to study it. Okay? So you have a sense of what, even at this time when she was writing, she was talking about, okay, there's different organizational dimensions, right? The conception and distribution of knowledge in the organization. Relations of authority within the organization. We've talked about these things. Methods of coordinating the work of workers and departments and divisions. How is technology going to be used for these three dimensions? And she laid out the positive vision, the vision that many people had hoped for, the vision that many of those people who were advancing these technologies were arguing would be the future. And then she looks at the negative vision. And I want you to look at this carefully because, you know, given the time she wrote, think about, well, which way did it end up? Did we realize the positive vision? Did we realize the negative vision? In what areas is it positive? In what areas is it negative? Do a little analysis with this. So I'm not going to go through the chart. I'm asking you to read it, understand it. The term panopticon comes from, I believe it was Jeremy Bentham, who was a British philosopher. And this is sort of the classic view of the panopticon. And the idea is that everyone can be surveilled by one person in one location. Okay? So you have this tower in the middle. These are the surveillors, we'll say, and these are the surveillees. So from one position, you are able to observe what everyone is doing in every place within this organization. Now, quite often when people talk about the panopticon, and this image obviously suggests a prison, maybe that's an appropriate metaphor for the workplace. And in fact, many people have borrowed from a book I used to use in organization theory by a guy named Gareth Morgan. And he wrote this really widely read book called Images of Organizations. And people have these ideas of what organizations are. And one of them was a psychic prison. Okay? That was one metaphor. Another metaphor was the machine. Okay? So he had all of these ways that people describe. And this is certainly the carceral prison metaphor. Now, this is physically watching someone, right? Before the development of digital technology. This is something that's not that unusual today. You've seen these kinds of screens in different places, in different organizations. This was taken from a film. Maybe you can let me know what it was. I'm not sure. That's looks like Morgan Freeman standing there. But you can see what we're talking about, a digital panopticon where you're always under surveillance. And I always tell students they're always under surveillance. Just assume it all the time. Okay. All right. So the article you're reading, I'm just going to touch on a few items that they highlight, the authors highlight. Sean King. All right. I'm not sure if that's the same Sean King I'm thinking of. But anyway, surveillance versus monitoring. Language is important. And the term you use to describe something obviously matters. And I always point this out by saying, over in the business school, they talk about the management of the human resource. And in sociology, I would say it's the social control of the human factor. Okay? Management versus social control, right? Those two terms obviously have different connotations, and that's the point King is making. Surveillance sounds darker. Monitoring sounds like something, it's kind of routine. You need to be monitoring what's happening. That's, of course, what any organization wanted. Surveillance, that's crossing the line, right? So the point is, we have now information technologies. You're all familiar with them. They are a part of the labor process, and they provide opportunities for surveillance, keeping track of what you're doing. And one of the challenges managers have always had is that they don't really know how hard people are working. They want them to expend enormous amounts of effort, but they're never quite sure, right? Maybe they're soldiering. That was a term that Frederick Taylor used to describe what workers do when they get into groups, right? They soldier, which means basically they're loafing. I think there was a term used in this article, cyber loafing, okay? We'll talk about forms of resistance. That's a form of lollygagging. It's a term you certainly don't hear that term very often. Lollygagging is just kind of screwing off, not working hard, just effing off, okay? Basically. The regulation of time, right? And time theft is something we'll talk about. We'll also talk about wage theft. Remember that if They can monitor what you're doing all the time, on the job, off the job, when you go home, when you log in to your computer, even though you're connecting to the organization you're working in, all these things. People analytics, it's a nice way of putting the surveillance of all kinds of data that's collected on individuals. We have something called data analytics at the university. You should know that we're collecting all kinds of information about what you do, what courses you take. You have that little card, right? You use that card to check in we know where you're going, right? Think about it. Surveillance extends every institution, every organization. Now, maybe that information would be used to develop policies that would help students. It's possible, okay? But nonetheless, it is a little bit of a violation of privacy. And that's a big part of the issue here. Also, benchmarking, right? So if you can keep track of what workers are doing and you realize that one worker is able to sort of create a high level of productivity, you would basically say, well, that's the benchmarking. That's the standard that everyone is going to have to meet. Right? So, from the perspective of what we've introduced in this class, owners and managers are always trying to figure out some way to maximize what we call intensify labor. Excuse me. So I thought this was a nice little diagram that's included in the article talking about the range of employee techniques, some devoted to productivity, some devoted to just the behaviors that people engage in, which they would view as positive or negative, and certain personality characteristics, right? All of this data is collected on you as individuals. Okay, I stopped recording there for a minute. Have something in my throat. Needed to get a little water. All right, so take a look at those different aspects of the surveillance techniques: productivity, behavior, personal characteristics. Again, you can see that we're broadening the range of kinds of data that can be collected on you as individuals, as workers, as students. All right. If I stop there we go. Okay. A few other things touched on in this article, which I think are worth just pointing out, but I really encourage you to read the article. One of the reasons I selected this article is, even though it tends to focus its research on call centers, it introduces and raises the whole range of issues that are important to understand in how technology is being applied and implemented in workplaces. So it has that sort of double function of focusing on, so you have some nice examples from the call center, but also it introduces these broader concepts: monitoring, surveillance, biometric monitoring. Okay, many of you actually probably have something attached to you that keeps track of aspects of your biological, physiological functioning. You need to know, because everyone thinks this stuff is cool and neat. Maybe they think, they get some level of prestige by having these technologies. You shouldn't be so naive, okay? Somebody is collecting information on everything you do. These people that have these devices in their home that they talk to, that they ask like to turn on the TV or what time it is, man, take that thing out in the driveway and just, smash it with a hammer or maybe a bat, okay? This stuff is, I don't know why anyone would, subject themselves to this sort of stuff. I have in my house one of these little like robotic vacuum cleaners. Well, that's collecting data on the size of my house. And then maybe I'll be getting ads about, given the size of your house. And I'm like, how the hell do you know what the size of my house is? This stuff, you cannot control. It's everywhere. All right, function creep. You introduce one form of technology because maybe it's a good way to sort of count what is happening in the, quantifying something. And the next thing you know, it's being used to control, to monitor, to surveil, evaluate. So that's a very important concept, function creep. These technologies end up being used in ways that perhaps they weren't meant to. Remember, manifest function, latent function, function creep. Make those connections, right? So again, when we think about the biometric, we're talking about, measuring your mood, your fatigue, your stress, your emotions, all realms of human experience is now data collected by somebody else. And that somebody else might be somebody that wants to manipulate you. I don't want to get paranoid. I don't want to get conspiratorial, but you really need to be aware of how these technologies are being used. Now, one thing I always point out, my organization theory book, and I'm going to show you a couple diagrams from that book because the entire book was based on a fundamental premise, and that is anytime managers or owners or capitalists attempt to implement something as a way to control workers, monitor workers, surveil workers, the human factor. Humans are conscious and reflective, and they interpret things subjectively, and that creates often consequences that are counterproductive. That's an unintended consequence, right? You think you're controlling the workers know you're controlling them, and it impacts maybe how they feel about the organization, how committed they are, how often they attend work. Turnover creates hostility, creates distrust. They make reference to idiocultural as a concept, the idea that groups of people develop sort of common ways of understanding, and they use this in the context of resistance to some extent, how workers are able to, as a group, develop an understanding of what is going on, this idiocultural. And I think it's an interesting way to think about the human factor. Things that happen with humans that don't happen with, if you got 5 forklifts next to each other, and maybe you've been pushing those forklifts really hard all day, the forklifts aren't going to talk to each other. They're not conscious. They're not reflective. They're not going to go on strike. They're not going to reduce the amount of work they do by virtue of being overextended. So, these ideas of to what extent do people accept these technologies in order to organizations, to what extent do they resist them? So, when I was putting together my organization theory book, I had this paradox model. And the paradox is essentially you have this action in the middle. Maybe this is the action of managers. It has an intended consequence, probably to expand production, maximize profit, right? And therefore achieving the organizational objective of rising profit, rising productivity. But there's always an unintended consequence, right? And that unintended consequence, something they didn't anticipate, something they certainly didn't intend, might nullify. That's why there's a negative sign. This advances the organizational interest. This nullifies it. And then I apply it in a more specific way here. Managerial strategy. You maybe modify some structure of the organization in order to increase profit and performance. But there's a subjective human consequence. Maybe they don't like it. Maybe they feel it's too, onerous. Maybe it's, pushing them a little too hard. Whatever it is, humans can subjectively react and say, I don't like this. And I'm going to figure out a way to minimize the harm it's going to do to me. And then I just expanded this to understanding the evolution of organization theory, organizational structure techniques apply to the human factor. The human factor responds. Managers have to accommodate that response. They have to figure out a way to, either mollify the worker or convince them that it's okay, or maybe alter the structure in some way because the consequences of what they're doing has become so counterproductive. And then you have revisions, not only in what is happening in organizations, but we have noted over time that organization theories themselves evolve. And the evolution of organization theories is largely due to the way workers have responded to what managers and owners attempt to do in controlling them. All right. Now, there's a lot that's been written about workplace resistance, obviously from the perspective of critical analysis from the left, certainly from Marxists. There is an effort to try to see to what extent workers understand what's happening to them, develop some level of, let's say, class consciousness, organize, resist, etc. And Randy Hodson, this article was written some time ago, but it's still, I think, relevant for what we're talking about here. He says there's basically 4 forms of resistance when he was writing. And he was writing well before some of these information technologies had been implemented in workplaces. And one was deflecting abuse. And that's when you've got some, direct. So let me take a step back. Hodson looks at these different forms of resistance. He develops the 4 ways, but he applies them in the context of what we discussed before, and that's Richard Edwards' contested terrain. Remember, Edwards said 3 forms of control: direct control, where you're actually watching, standing over, pushing, driving workers. There's technological control, where the technology is in one way or another shaping the level of work effort. And then you've got bureaucratic forms of control, which we talked about in great detail last week. So Hodson sort of takes these individual forms and says deflecting abuse is the technique that workers would use when they're being subjected to direct control. Regulating the amount and intensity of work, technical control. Defending autonomy from the effort by bureaucratic rules and regulations to control them and, in some sense, coerce them to conform. You want to carve out some autonomy, some freedom from all of the bureaucratic control. And then he adds expanding and manipulating working control through organizational participation schemes. And there what he's talking about is there was a period when organizations were going through lots of experimental methods to include workers more actively in different kinds of decision-making, quality circles, Japanese forms of management. And his point here is that workers can often take advantage of those as a way to develop resistance techniques. The one thing I want to point out, I always point this out, and I think I pointed out when we discussed this idea of quiet quitting, is to distinguish between resistance that individuals sort of figure out on the job, right? You're getting pushed, maybe you're not happy, and you sort of individually figure out adaptation strategies, coping strategies. That's distinct from collective forms of resistance, which is organized forms among a large number of workers in a systematic way to oppose what one might find noxious. All right. Here's a title: Workplace Surveillance is Becoming the New Normal for U.S. Workers. And here's another one. This is related to that idea of quiet quitting. Forget quiet quitting. Employers are doing shocking things to monitor your productivity. Much of this conversation has accelerated since the pandemic as more and more workers are working remotely, but even though they're not in the factory under the supervision of managers, owners, supervisors, they want to know what you're doing. And so one reason remote work might be more permissible today than in the past is because we now have the information technologies that allow people to monitor what workers are doing at home. Remember when we talked about the putting out system, where the capitalists gave workers the tools and the materials and said, go home, come back with as many as you can produce. The capitalists really never knew how much soldiering was taking place, lollygagging, loafing. Now we have these information technologies, and they allow the owners and the managers and the supervisors to keep track of you remotely in a way that was not possible before. So this is pretty good, because here it says recording keystrokes, tracking mouse movement. Then I found this wonderful little article. Home workers use clever tricks to resist productivity monitoring technology. There's something called a mouse jiggler. Here's one thing I'll say. When people want to resist, they can be really fucking creative, okay? They will come up with some technique, some method, right, to circumvent the method of surveillance, the method of monitoring, the method of evaluation. The mouse jiggler, a little cradle. You plug it into the wall, set your mouse on it, it moves it around. You can go online and see YouTube videos of this. And of course, it looks like you're working, right? So, it's like the jujitsu. It's like, okay, they're going to use technology. I'm going to use technology too, right? So it's like the technological form of resistance to technological surveillance. This is interesting. There's so many articles now coming out on this, and I was going to pull up a bunch of them, and I could overload you with this stuff. You can read the description of this. It's very interesting. Notice that this article, which was published recently in 2020, makes reference to Richard Edwards' work. So, Edwards wrote his book back in like the 80s, okay? But people still understand that the fundamental concept of contested terrain, okay, of modes of control, universal, right? And in this one, they talk about algo activism, okay? Algorithms and algo activism as a way to organize against some of the algorithms that are being used in the control of workers. So take a look at that. That's just give me a flavor of some of the interesting stuff that's being done. Amazon, of course, the most powerful organization in the world and has enormous resources. They want to know exactly what people are doing in the sweatshops, also known as fulfillment centers, which I've written about. I think I posted my little media piece on what I call the satanic warehouse. And these are wristbands. Okay? So again, people talk about, the wonderful innovations that have taken place over the last 20 and 30 years. Well, how are they being used? For what purpose? In whose interest? And here you've got a wristband that tracks what workers are doing inside the fulfillment sweatshop. If they slack off, the wristband will know. Amazon has a patent on that wristband. This stuff is, dystopian. Unlock your organization's full potential. Workplace analytics to drive continuous improvements. Manifest function. And benefit your business and benefit your people. It's to benefit you, workers. That's a manifest function. Okay? And so you walk around with this thing. You use it to go from place to place. This is a little bit like that UNFID card you have. Okay? I like this quote at the bottom, by the person who developed this. So we've added some additional sensors onto those ID badges, microphones. Now they're recording your conversations. You didn't know that. Probably didn't know. Bluetooth, infrared. That has enabled us to really understand at a millisecond level what's going on at the company. There's your sweatshop, Amazon sweatshop. These workers will organize eventually. They will walk out. It's just a matter of time. LinkedIn. How many of you follow LinkedIn? How many of you have logged into LinkedIn? You got to be careful participating in these efforts to try to promote yourself as a commodity in the labor market. It's Black Mirror-like. Okay, some of you are familiar with that program. There's a lot in Black Mirror that connects the emerging and future technologies to the social control, surveillance, and dystopian aspects. And these are a couple clips, just images from Black Mirror. And I remember this episode explicitly because they were keeping track of exactly how fast and how well people were working, and that would give them a certain amount of credit that they could be using outside of work. All right. I started by telling you that this woman, Shoshana Zuboff, 1984, in the age of the smart machine, asking all of the right questions, which I hope you can reflect on and answer. And I gave you that little table, positive vision, negative vision. Well, she wrote a book several years ago. I would strongly recommend this book. Maybe I've already mentioned it. I can't remember. I talk about it in all my classes. It's a very, very, let's see if it's laying around here. No, it's in the other room. Okay. It's about this thick. It's 800, 900 pages. It's worth reading. Not everyone has the time to read it. Not everyone can afford to buy the book. Check out her YouTube videos where she talks about the book, presents the argument. Maybe there's an article she published that summarizes it. It's one of the most, I think, sophisticated analyses of how these major, largely online, we'll call them platforms, we're going to talk more about these platforms, are collecting data on you every single day, every time you log in, every time you do a search, every time you communicate with somebody, every time you post something on Facebook. All of this data is being collected. You're using these apps for free. You're thinking, isn't it great? They're free. Well, it's not entirely free, and there's a reason it's free. Because you are providing them with massive amounts of what she calls, she's not a Marxist, but she utilizes some Marxian ideas and concepts, behavioral surplus. That's what they're collecting. They're collecting information on every single thing you do, every single thing you like, every single thing you buy, everything you check out that you're not going to buy but you're interested in, and they sell it to advertisers. This is all done for the purpose, private profit. So when we talk about the wonders of innovation, I'm very critical. The wonders of innovation, now we've got surveillance technology in the workplace. The wonders of innovation, we got Facebook, Amazon, Google collecting information. We have no, even though we are the ones that are providing stuff, we have no control. We make no decisions that impact how they use the data, who they give it to. Utterly undemocratic. So we've allowed these corporations to essentially appropriate all of the advances in innovative information technologies that we use every day. Anyway, so much more I could say about her book. I would just encourage you, if you're interested in these topics, to check it out. All right. A nice, concise lecture today. 39 minutes. Not bad. All right. That's week 4. I will see you next week.